America is not fighting in the Middle East for oil. It is not there to spread democracy. It is fighting to protect the money in your wallet. That wall of $39 trillion in debt is the real red line. That mountain of debt is crushing Washington. In the current game, America cannot afford to step back, but it also cannot move forward. So look closely at this boiling desert. Why is the most elite military force in history being boxed in by a country that is poorer by tens of times? In 2002, Lieutenant General Paul Van Riper walked into a Pentagon war simulation and played the role of Iran's commander. In under 10 minutes, he used small boats and motorcycle couriers to sink 19 US warships. Unable to deal with asymmetric tactics, the military referees had to resurrect the fleet so America could win. That simulated battle exposed a systemic weakness the Pentagon could not fix, and one it is now paying for in the real world. Now look at Washington's real choices on the board. If it decides to push forward and launch a ground invasion, it will repeat the same kind of land war quagmire it faced in Vietnam. But if it pulls back and accepts withdrawal in exchange for peace, it will lose its grip over the entire Gulf. Push forward, and there is blood. Pull back, and a financial empire begins to collapse. Both roads lead straight to disaster. And this brutal choice is no longer just theoretical. The deadline arrived in June of 2024, when the most important core agreement in the region disappeared. Let me walk you through, step by step, why this trap was designed so perfectly that there may be no way out. The first step in understanding this trap is to look at the failure of traditional military power. America's high-tech weapons have been effectively neutralized in the Gulf. For more than 2 decades, declassified records have shown that the Pentagon repeatedly suffers devastating losses against the Iranian tactics. And it all begins with a brutally simple cost equation. America has the Patriot interceptor system, one of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. But each Patriot missile costs as much as $4 million. Meanwhile, a one-way attack drone can be mass-produced for around $20,000. You cannot keep using a $4 million weapon to shoot down a $20,000 toy every single day. That is the core logic of asymmetric warfare. They do not need to destroy the entire US military on the battlefield. They only need to wreck the Pentagon's balance sheet. And that weakness is not limited to the skies. It extends across the sea and onto the ground. To wage war, America depends heavily on carrier strike groups. These are giant floating fortresses, the backbone of nearly every foreign intervention. But the Strait of Hormuz is an extremely narrow funnel of water. And in that confined space, the massive size of US warships turns them into moving targets. Iran has spent 20 years designing a defense system built specifically to crack that threat. Unlike Iraq, it did not line up tanks in the desert to become easy targets for air power. It dispersed its forces into deep underground networks beneath the rugged Zagros Mountains. It effectively stripped Washington of its air superiority. You cannot bomb what satellites and radar cannot see. And if the US wants to send in infantry to eliminate the threat at its root, the trap slams shut. To cut off the enemy's financial lifeline, the US would have to seize Karg Island. That tiny island handles up to 90% of Iran's oil exports. But Karg sits close to the coast and is protected by thousands of artillery positions on the mainland. If the US wants to hold Karg, Marines would be forced to land on the mainland and wipe out those gun positions. And the moment American boots touch the Zagros Mountains, the mission creep nightmare begins. What starts as a limited operation escalates into a ground war that drags tens of thousands of lives into a conflict with no end. Now look at this brutal contrast. A supercarrier worth $13 billion. The ultimate symbol of Western power, forced to stay far from shore, threatened by nameless fiberglass speedboats. But this military deadlock is not even the worst part. Because the moment America shows the world that it cannot win with weapons, panic spreads to the people hiding beneath its security umbrella. And that is when the second domino begins to fall. Think back to the moment General Paul Van Riper resigned in the middle of that Pentagon exercise. American strategists rigged the game to hide how vulnerable the fleet really was. But they were not just lying to themselves. The Gulf monarchies were watching too, and they understood the brutal truth behind the reports. America can no longer protect them forever. Now, many people will argue that the Gulf states cannot simply abandon a long-standing alliance. They will point to the giant military bases housing tens of thousands of US troops. They will point to weapons deals worth tens of billions of dollars, but this systemic fracture is not happening because they suddenly hate America. It is happening because in the ruthless world of geopolitics, survival always comes before friendship. When America's security umbrella starts to tear apart, they are forced to look for a new roof. And we have already seen that shift in the real world. Saudi Arabia, America's most important regional ally, crossed the red line. It sat down to normalize relations with Iran. And the broker was not Washington, it was Beijing. To understand why that compromise is so devastating, you have to look at the system itself. In international relations theory, there is an iron rule called realism. It says nations do not have permanent friends. They have permanent survival interests. For the last 80 years, this alliance has been built on a contract. Oil in exchange for security. The Arab states agreed to sell oil exclusively in dollars. In return, they received protection from the most powerful military on earth. But a protection contract only has value if you can still deliver on the promise. Cheap drones have already slipped through billion-dollar radar networks. They directly threaten oil infrastructure. At that point, America's deterrent power is gone. Its fleet is pinned down at sea. It cannot neutralize threats from asymmetric militias. Its presence no longer carries real meaning. And when a superpower proves it cannot protect you, you are forced to protect yourself. You have no other choice but to compromise with the very force threatening you. The Arab pivot is not some impulsive betrayal. It is a cold survival calculation. They are urgently diversifying their security partnerships because they now see that America is wearing down. They have watched the US rush out of other battlefields. They understand that when things get ugly, allies are often left behind. They cannot trust the fate of their nations to a military that looks increasingly powerless. Especially a military that keeps losing in its own war games, America may be forced to pull back from the conflict to avoid another Vietnam-style quagmire. That decision would create a massive power vacuum. And in geopolitics, power vacuums are always filled fast by someone else. That means America's monopoly over the Gulf is coming to an end. But even that geopolitical loss is not the worst part, because that retreat would open an even darker door. It leads straight to the collapse of a financial mechanism that has shaped the modern world. Now let's get to the real core of the system. America is not fighting in the Middle East because it is desperate for oil. Many people will argue that Washington no longer needs the Gulf. They will point to the shale revolution of the past decade, and they are right. The US now exports more oil than any other country in the world. But that does not mean the system is safe, because America is not fighting for oil. It is fighting for demand for the US dollar. Look at the structure that has shaped the world for the last 50 years. In 1974, the US signed a life or death agreement with Saudi Arabia. Gulf oil would be traded only in dollars. That was the petrodollar system. It created a perfect cycle of currency recycling. The Gulf states sold oil and accumulated mountains of dollars. But they did not lock those billions of paper bills in underground vaults. And they did not dump them into local banks either. They used those excess dollars to buy US Treasury bonds. Put simply, they used oil money to lend money right back to the US government. They bought Washington's debt in exchange for safe returns. That cycle became the blood pump of the entire Western economic system. Because of it, Washington could run endless deficits without triggering immediate inflation. But that machine has officially started to break down. In June of 2024, the core petrodollar agreement expired. Riyadh reportedly refused to renew that half-century arrangement, and it moved into projects like M-Bridge, a cross-border payment system designed to bypass America's financial network. Oil sales in other currencies have already begun to enter the conversation. And once oil no longer has to be sold in dollars, global demand for dollar reserves begins to collapse. Other countries no longer have a reason to force themselves to hold dollars. And if they do not need dollars, they stop buying US Treasury bonds. That is the fatal breaking point of the entire empire. $39 trillion. That is the gigantic public debt burden now hanging over the system. And the system depends completely on issuing new debt to pay off old debt. If the recycled dollar flows from the Gulf dry up, who buys the debt? The US government will struggle to roll over its obligations. It will be forced to drive domestic interest rates much higher to attract buyers. And exploding interest rates would crush the housing market. They would vaporize retirement funds and freeze the economy almost overnight. That is the petrodollar trap. A withdrawal from the Gulf means putting the reserve currency system itself at risk. America is using soldiers' lives to protect a balance sheet. It is fighting to preserve its ability to print money without end. And this is not the first time something like this has happened. Look back at the historic shock of 1971. After exhausting its gold reserves under the immense cost of the Vietnam War, America effectively defaulted on its old monetary promise. President Nixon went on television and ended the gold standard overnight. He had to tie the dollar to oil and military power in order to save it. Same mechanism, same rule. When an empire runs out of real backing, its currency begins to fail. This is not a prediction. It is a pattern that has happened before. So if trying to preserve a unipolar empire through military force is turning into a suicidal trap, what path actually leads out? This Gulf conflict does not exist in a bubble. It is directly connected to the wave of rearmament now unfolding in Japan. It is tied to the fractures and quiet compromises taking shape inside Europe. You cannot separate these geopolitical flashpoints from one another. They are all different symptoms of the same disease. A unipolar system collapsing under its own overload. When America stretches its forces everywhere, it loses strength at the points that matter most. Its allies see those fractures and begin rearming themselves. That is why the real solution is not sending more carriers or dropping more bombs. The only real answer now is a controlled reduction of power. This is not a moral argument. It is not an emotional plea. It is a survival equation based on hard system logic. An empire cannot keep spending more than it produces forever. If Washington's elite keep printing money to fund wars that cannot be won, they risk repeating the same brutal collapse that destroyed Rome. They will drain their own resources until the financial system snaps. But if they accept retreat and share power in a multipolar world, the core of the domestic economy may still be saved. They may lose the throne of absolute dominance, but they could preserve their industrial base and social stability. And the most dangerous variable in this transition is not the strength of the rival powers. It is the wounded ego of a superpower that has grown used to giving orders. Think back again to General Van Riper's lesson 2 decades ago. When faced with the reality that their fleet could lose, the Pentagon chose to cheat. It forced him to restart the game, to protect the empire's image. But the real world is not a computer simulation. If the system keeps blindly hiding its own exhaustion, there will be no reset button on the beaches of Karg. Thousands of real American soldiers will die for paper fantasies of power. And the inflation storm unleashed by a collapsing dollar will rip through every street at home, quietly erasing the savings of millions who thought they were safe. 2 decades ago, General Van Riper took off his headset and he quietly walked out of the Pentagon simulation room. He wanted to warn Washington about the brutal price of arrogance. What you just watched is not only a story about military exercises, It is a foundational lesson about invisible power. Fiat money has no intrinsic value on its own. The strength of a currency does not come from the central bank that prints it. It comes from the power behind the system that forces the world to keep using it. History has proven one cruel rule again and again. Great empires are rarely destroyed by outside enemies. They collapse because the cost of maintaining power drains them from within. So what do you think? Will America choose to step back and protect the core of its economy? Or will it gamble all $39 trillion on a war it cannot win?